Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past doesn't just whisper, it awakens. Here, buried truths rise from the dust, shadows speak in forgotten tongues, and every mystery dares you to look deeper. Step inside, where history reveals the darkness it tried to hide. In 1941, Carrows Bend was a thriving American town of 3,000 people. By 1942, it was gone, not abandoned, but erased. Every street sign removed, every record classified, every name wiped from history. They called it a clerical error. But declassified files tell a different story. Operation Ashfield, marked with one terrifying word, cleansed. Now, 80 years later, the town is fighting back. Streetlights glow in empty fields. Compasses spin wildly over buried streets. Satellite images show phantom grids where homes once stood. And a mysterious 7.3 Hz frequency pulses through the soil like a heartbeat. The government says Carrows Bend never existed. But the evidence says otherwise. Because some secrets won't stay buried even when you erase them from the map. What was so dangerous about this small American town that they had to unmake it from reality itself? The truth is more terrifying than any conspiracy theory. The erased town is remembering itself. And it wants us to know why we were made to forget. In the archives of forgotten America, there are stories buried not under dust, but under deliberate silence. One such silence begins with a map dated 1941, showing a perfect little town, nestled between the Ohio River and a stretch of road that no longer exists. Its name was Carrows Bend. And then, by 1942, it was gone. Not destroyed, not abandoned, erased. The streets once named after American ideals, liberty, union, providence, were stripped of their words. Every signpost left blank, every document redacted, as though the town itself had been unspoken from history. When government archivists stumbled upon its records decades later, they were marked restricted, stamped in faded ink that suggested more than secrecy, it suggested fear. The census listed 3,000 lives, but every single one vanished from public record within months. Their homes were gone. Their graves unmarked. Even their photographs carried the same haunting omission, the street names blacked out, one by one, like someone erasing memory itself. Neighbors remembered strange nights, convoys of unmarked trucks arriving under curfew, signs pried from their bolts, paint dripping into the dust. Those who tried to speak of it later were told they misremembered, that no such place had ever existed. But then came the aerial photos, the ones they couldn't explain. A full grid of roads visible from the sky, but when mapped, the coordinates led only to open fields. They said Carrows Bend was just a clerical error. A misprint. But buried deep in declassified files lies a different phrase, Operation Ashfield. No context, no detail, just a name, sitting beside a single word, cleansed. Whatever happened in that place, it was never meant to be remembered. And yet, sometimes, late at night, drivers along the old state route claim to see street lamps glowing faintly in the distance, standing where no roads remain. No names. No map. Just the ghost of a town that once existed, and the mystery of why someone made sure we'd forget it ever did. The discovery that set this entire enigma into motion, an American map, dated 1941, unearthed from a forgotten corner of the National Archives. The document was ordinary in appearance, a printed survey of small towns and counties in the Midwest, but something about it drew the archivist's attention. In a patch of rural land between two familiar highways was a name that no longer existed on any current map, *Carrows Bend. It wasn't a penciled note or a smudge of ink, it was printed clearly, labeled with borders, streets, and population figures. The town looked well established, with a school, church, and civic center. Yet when the archivist cross-referenced it with modern records, he found nothing. The coordinates pointed to an empty field, miles of grassland stretching toward the horizon with no visible trace of human life. Intrigued, he began searching through other records from the era: land deeds, census lists, and postal routes. Strangely, every document from before 1942 acknowledged Carrow's Bend as a living settlement, complete with an active postal code and a registered population exceeding 3,000. But from 1942 onward, the name vanished. The postal directory skipped over its number entirely, the census marked the residents as relocated, and the land deeds were voided. Not a single record mentioned a fire, flood, or disaster. The town hadn't been destroyed, it had been erased. Even more disturbing, when the archivist requested the township survey files for Carrow's Bend, he was told they were restricted under an old military classification order still in effect. As he dug deeper, anomalies multiplied. Aerial photographs from the early 1940s revealed a dense network of streets, rows of homes, and a grid layout characteristic of planned communities. But later photos, taken just months after the first, showed only barren terrain. The soil looked freshly turned, as though the earth itself had been unsettled. Still, there were no demolition permits, no record of evacuation, no newspaper coverage, no trace of how an entire town disappeared without notice. Even the state library's archives had blank spaces where maps of that region should have been, their catalogue cards missing or stamped withdrawn. The archivist's curiosity turned to unease when he realized that Carrow's Bend wasn't a ghost town, it was a phantom of administration, wiped clean from both paper and memory. Towns fade, populations migrate, but bureaucracies never forget. Yet this one had been forcibly forgotten, meticulously cut out of history like a page torn from a book. The discovery raised a question more chilling than any natural disaster could explain: what could justify the government erasing an entire American town, and what secret was buried beneath its streets so deep that even its name had to be removed from time itself? Focuses on the haunting discovery made by cartographers and surveyors who attempted to remap the vanished town years after its erasure. When government teams revisited the area in the late 1940s to update regional boundaries, they encountered something that defied geographical logic. The terrain matched old maps in shape and contour, but the infrastructure had subtly shifted, as if the town had been rebuilt, then abandoned, under a new alignment. Roads that once ran straight now curved unnaturally, foundations appeared a few feet away from where they were originally plotted, and some streets simply ended mid-path in open fields. Even more disturbing was the discovery of half-buried street markers engraved in metal, but corroded to the point where the names were illegible, as though intentionally sanded down. Some were found stacked neatly in drainage ditches, others lying miles away from where they should have been, as if carried off and discarded in haste. The survey teams noted that compasses behaved erratically throughout the region, swinging unpredictably near certain intersections that no longer existed. Aerial photographs revealed faint, symmetrical grid lines beneath the surface soil, detectable only under certain light conditions. It was as if the ghost of the town's design persisted beneath the earth, visible only to machines and shadow. Several workers later reported strange auditory distortions while on-site, footsteps echoing where none were, a faint hum that seemed to come from beneath the ground, and voices faintly repeating names that no one recognized. These accounts were officially omitted from the published field reports, yet preserved in personal diaries and internal correspondence obtained decades later through archival leaks. The cartographic inconsistencies soon drew the attention of independent researchers, who compared the erased town's layout to other settlements established by the same land development company. The pattern was unmistakable. The street geometry matched those of planned communities built near major industrial corridors, sites often linked to pre-war testing facilities and resource extraction zones. This led to the theory that the town's disappearance was connected not to social decline, but to something being deliberately hidden under the guise of urban reorganization. One investigator found that the soil samples near the former main square contained unusual magnetic residue, potentially from heavy equipment or experimental machinery. If true, it would suggest the town was repurposed in secret, its map rewritten to conceal what replaced it. Locals who lived near the perimeter of the vanished town spoke of how, even after its erasure, street lamps would still flicker on at night in empty fields, powered by lines that no longer existed on record. They called it the town that remembered itself, a place whose bones still moved beneath the earth, refusing to stay forgotten even after every trace of its name was scraped from the map. The eerie disappearance of public records related to the town's development, a mystery that defies both logic and historical procedure. Normally, even the smallest settlements in 19th and early 20th century America maintained extensive documentation, property deeds, tax ledgers, infrastructure plans, and census data, all meticulously archived either at the county courthouse or the state library. Yet for this particular town, founded and flourishing by the early 1900s, everything seems to have been wiped clean by 1942. County registries list no trace of its original layout, no blueprints of its roads, and no legal acknowledgement of the street names that once defined it. This absence is not a clerical error, it's an erasure. What's more, maps from the 1930s still show the town in detail, with streets clearly labeled and neighborhoods intact, but the revised cartographic editions released just a decade later show blank spaces where those names should be, as though the land itself had been anonymized by design. Historians investigating this anomaly found peculiar inconsistencies in the archived topographical surveys, ink mismatches, faint outlines of names scratched out under layers of overwriting, and inconsistent numbering systems that made navigation impossible. Such coordinated disappearance would have required authority, either governmental or corporate. Evidence points toward a municipal reclassification project launched around 1941, officially described as regional standardization. However, none of the paperwork survived, and the few surviving officials from that era, when later interviewed, spoke with a strange hesitancy, referring to the town as a place better left unnamed. This phrase, repeated almost identically by three separate witnesses decades apart, suggests that something deeper, something beyond bureaucratic restructuring, motivated the removal of identity. A chilling possibility emerges when one considers the wartime context. 1942 was a year of heightened secrecy, with federal orders suppressing information that might reveal locations tied to defense manufacturing, experimental technology, or covert relocation programs. Some researchers speculate that the town's street names may have corresponded to military project code names or sensitive personnel movements, data that demanded total concealment once classified. Others suspect environmental contamination or industrial accidents that rendered the site uninhabitable, prompting authorities to redact all identifiers to prevent public inquiry. Yet the most unsettling theory doesn't involve government intervention at all, it suggests that the townspeople themselves participated in their own erasure. Oral accounts from neighboring regions describe how residents, shortly before vanishing, began repainting their signs, removing directional markers, and referring to streets only by landmarks or personal nicknames. It was as if they collectively decided to dissolve their map, to sever their existence from history's coordinates. Whatever the reason, by 1942 the town no longer existed on paper, and its roads, though still visible from the air, led nowhere officially recognized. The eyewitness accounts that emerged from the final residents who lived in the town before 1942, testimonies that were later collected in fragmented interviews and forgotten newspaper clippings. These accounts, though inconsistent in detail, converged on a shared, unsettling memory, the sense that something had shifted beneath the town months before it officially disappeared. Residents recalled how street signs were gradually taken down, not by vandals or officials, but by men in unmarked trucks who worked at night, their headlights dimmed and their movements quiet, methodical, almost rehearsed. No one knew who had hired them, and when questioned, local authorities claimed no knowledge of any such operation. Within weeks, mail stopped arriving correctly, as though the postal system itself had lost recognition of the streets it had served for decades. Letters came back marked address not found, even when sent from within the same county. Store owners described an atmosphere that grew more disoriented each day. Maps of the town sold in local shops began showing subtle variations: roads shortened, intersections renamed, and entire blocks shaded out as undeveloped land. People who had lived there for generations suddenly couldn't navigate their own neighborhoods without feeling lost. It was as though the geography itself was being rewritten while they slept. Some claimed the ground trembled faintly at night, others reported hearing the rhythmic pounding of metal deep underground, like distant construction with no visible machinery. A few elderly residents swore that new fences appeared overnight, sealing off parts of the town's north sector where the oldest homes once stood. Then came the disappearances. Not of people at first, but of records. Deeds, blueprints, census files, entire archives vanished from municipal storage, replaced by blank folders or falsified duplicates showing the land as uninhabited. Those who questioned it too loudly found themselves silenced in subtle ways: bank accounts frozen, employment terminated, or family members urged to relocate for safety. The final days before the town's erasure became a blur of confusion. Street names began vanishing from official maps entirely, as if the place had never existed. Witnesses who stayed until the last trains departed spoke of hearing coordinated announcements over the radio instructing residents to evacuate due to administrative restructuring. No one knew what that meant, but most obeyed. When the last families left, the men with unmarked trucks returned. They filled the streets, removed every signpost, and painted over every road marking. Within a matter of days, the once bustling town became a blank grid of asphalt and silence. Those who returned years later found nothing but fields and foundations, the faint echo of where their homes had stood, and the haunting realization that the town had not died, it had been deliberately unmade, as though someone wanted to erase not just its presence, but its memory. The sudden government involvement following the town's disappearance and how official intervention only deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. In the months after the final evacuation of residents in 1942, military personnel were seen establishing a perimeter around the former town's borders. Trucks bearing insignias from multiple federal departments arrived under the cover of darkness, accompanied by surveyors and uniformed guards who turned away anyone attempting to enter the area. What once had been a thriving community was instantly transformed into a restricted zone, its boundaries guarded by silence and barbed wire. The government released a vague statement claiming the area was being repurposed for national security infrastructure, but no records ever surfaced to support such a claim. The lack of transparency created a vacuum that invited speculation, and those who lived nearby began piecing together strange details the officials could not hide. Residents from neighboring towns reported low, pulsating noises echoing from the restricted zone at night, along with flickers of blue light that illuminated the horizon like distant storms. Some claimed to see figures moving in formation across the deserted fields. Others described an odor of ozone and burnt metal drifting in the air, as though something electrical had been awakened beneath the soil. Trains began arriving on closed tracks late at night, their cargo unknown, their destinations never logged. Engineers who once worked on the town's original infrastructure, its power grid, its tunnels, and its underground reservoirs, were quietly relocated, and their employment records later classified. It was as though every trace of the town's original design had been absorbed into a secret project no one was allowed to acknowledge. Local journalists who attempted to investigate met resistance. Their reports were seized, their photographs confiscated, and their publications received anonymous warnings about compromising wartime secrecy. One reporter, who managed to sneak onto the site, later described in her journal finding massive concrete slabs covering what had once been the town's central avenue. Beneath them, she heard the faint hum of generators and the mechanical rhythm of moving parts. Her notes ended abruptly, and she disappeared days later, her car found abandoned on a forest road just outside the restricted area. By 1944, maps of the region officially listed the former town as federal property. No explanation was ever offered to the public. When the war ended, the perimeter fencing remained, guarded by private contractors instead of soldiers. What lay beneath the surface of that erased town became the subject of endless speculation. Some believed it was a testing facility, others whispered it was a cover for something older, something unearthed rather than built. But what remained certain was that the government had not simply claimed the land, it had sealed a secret inside it, one powerful enough to rewrite an entire community out of existence. The strange phenomenon that began affecting nearby towns after the disappearance of the erased settlement, signs that whatever had been buried beneath its surface did not stay contained. Within a few years of 1942, reports surfaced of compasses spinning wildly, machinery malfunctioning without cause, and animals avoiding certain patches of land as if sensing an invisible boundary. Farmers who tilled soil near the restricted perimeter described finding blackened stones that emitted faint warmth even in winter, their surfaces etched with geometric patterns that resembled street grids. Some of these stones were collected by locals, but those who kept them for long reported insomnia, hallucinations, and an inexplicable compulsion to return them to where they were found. It was as though the remnants of the town were calling to be reassembled, whispering a pattern that no one could interpret. Residents began to notice subtle distortions in the environment, shadows that didn't align with their sources, echoes that carried words instead of sounds, and sudden temperature drops near the old railway tracks that once led directly into the Vanish district. Travelers described hearing faint music at night when the wind shifted east, like the ghost of a town's rhythm replaying through the landscape. The melody was familiar to older locals, it matched the tune of the town's former clock tower chime, dismantled years before its erasure. When a few amateur radio operators tuned into the frequencies near the old border, they intercepted bursts of signal that repeated numerical sequences matching the town's original postal codes. The transmissions were too faint to trace, yet consistent enough to suggest that something, perhaps mechanical, perhaps not, was still active beneath the surface. By the early 1950s, locals had coined a name for the phenomenon, the residue. It became a whispered explanation for every unaccountable event in the surrounding counties: lost time, flickering lights, or the sudden reappearance of landmarks long destroyed. Some said the land itself retained memory, replaying fragments of its erased existence through electromagnetic echoes. Others believed the government's project had ruptured a barrier between the physical and the constructed, trapping the town's blueprint in a kind of perpetual loop. When geologists attempted to survey the region using sonar mapping, their readings showed underground cavities forming a perfect grid, exactly mirroring the layout of the old streets. But when the images were sent for analysis, the data was classified, and the scientists were silenced by non-disclosure orders. Despite the suppression, a few fragments escaped: notes, sketches, and first-hand reports that hinted the erased town was not gone but preserved in a dormant state, encoded into the earth like an architectural fossil. Locals continued to speak of lights beneath the soil that pulsed in rhythmic intervals, almost like a heartbeat, suggesting that the town itself had not died but was waiting, quietly, to be remembered again. Focuses on the rediscovery of the erased town's original blueprints, documents long thought destroyed but uncovered decades later in the archives of a defunct railway company. The find occurred in 1967, when a retired engineer sorting through storage crates stumbled upon a rolled set of linen maps stamped with the town's name and the date of its last recorded update, April 1942. At first glance, they appeared to be ordinary municipal plans, but upon closer inspection, something deeply unsettling emerged. The blueprints contained not one, but two layers of markings, the faint, almost translucent outlines of an alternate street system drawn directly beneath the visible one. These underlying grids didn't correspond to any known urban design principles, their geometry was unnervingly precise, composed of concentric loops and mirrored axes, as though the town had been designed to channel something unseen. When architectural historians analyzed the documents, they found numerical codes embedded within the measurements, patterns that repeated every 7 blocks, forming ratios identical to those used in early radio frequency harmonics. This revelation led to a chilling theory, that the town's layout might have been intentionally designed to function as more than a residential grid. It could have been an instrument, a vast geometric construct capable of amplifying electromagnetic or acoustic energy. Researchers cross-referenced the design with wartime patents and found connections to experimental resonance technologies being developed in secrecy during the early 1940s. The idea that an entire town could serve as a disguised test site for such a system suddenly seemed plausible. But the most haunting discovery came from marginal annotations written in red ink along the blueprint's border. They were not engineering notes but cryptic warnings, phrases like containment radius, resonance breach, and limit exposure to 7.3 cycles. One line simply read, "No renaming beyond Phase 3. The handwriting matched that of the town's chief surveyor, who had disappeared just weeks before the town's erasure. His family later claimed he had become obsessed with the echo of the ground, spending nights mapping tremors that seemed to correspond with the town's street intersections. When the recovered blueprints were submitted to the State Historical Archive for preservation, they vanished within months. Officially, the disappearance was blamed on a filing error during transfer to the Federal Record Office, but the timing coincided precisely with the sudden reactivation of military interest in the region. The retired engineer who discovered the plans died under mysterious circumstances shortly after giving a public lecture on spatial resonance in urban design. His notes, found later, contained a single line written across the final page: "The town was never meant to be lived in, it was meant to be turned on." Those words reignited every conspiracy that had ever surrounded the erased settlement and forced historians to confront a terrifying question. What had the Lenhot grid, as the plans called it, really been built to do? The chilling aftermath of the blueprint revelation, how a new wave of independent researchers, journalists, and local historians descended upon the erased town's location, determined to uncover the truth, only to find themselves ensnared in patterns of disappearance eerily similar to those from 1942. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, small investigative teams began making quiet trips into the restricted area, some armed with geophysical sensors, others with nothing but cameras and courage. What they found defied explanation. The land appeared deceptively ordinary at first: rolling hills, scattered trees, and open grass, but every compass, watch, and radio behaved abnormally within a 1-mile radius of the old town center. Some reported sudden bursts of static that morphed into whispered speech, others claimed their timepieces lost synchronization, jumping backward by minutes or hours. When they tried to retrace their steps, landmarks would vanish behind them as if the terrain itself were shifting subtly, rearranging to disorient them. One investigative duo from a Boston-based publication documented their findings in a series of field tapes. On the third night, their recorder picked up a rhythmic humming that intensified as they approached what should have been the old main square. The pitch of the sound followed a perfect frequency pattern, 7.3 cycles per second, precisely the number written in red ink on the erased blueprints. The next morning, the men were gone, their camp untouched, their equipment running on loop until the batteries died. Their footage was later recovered by a park ranger, but the reels had degraded unnaturally fast, showing streaks of light in frames where no light source existed. By 1975, government interest had reignited, and access to the area was once again restricted. This only fueled more public fascination. Amateur explorers began referring to the site as the grid, claiming it was the location of a buried transmitter or an unfinished experiment capable of manipulating magnetic fields. But those who returned from it often displayed disturbing symptoms: disorientation, paranoia, and vivid recurring dreams of walking endless streets that had no signs, no people, and no horizon. A few drew maps of what they saw in their sleep, perfectly matching the erased town's original layout, even though none of them had ever seen the blueprints. One particularly haunting account came from a geologist who spent 3 nights near the center of the restricted zone. He described a faint glow beneath the soil that pulsed like the heartbeat of a living organism. Each time he approached it, his instruments malfunctioned, and the glow faded, as if responding to his presence. Before leaving, he recorded his final observation: "It isn't gone. It's waiting." Weeks later, he vanished during a solo return trip. His abandoned truck was found idling on the roadside, the radio still whispering the same 7.3 Hz hum that no one could trace. Examines the disturbing resurfacing of the erased town's name in official records decades after its disappearance, a bureaucratic ghost that began to appear, uninvited, in systems that should have forgotten it. It started quietly in the late 1980s when county tax offices began receiving automated database errors listing properties under a township code that hadn't existed since 1942. Clerks dismissed it as a glitch until the same name began appearing on federal infrastructure reports, satellite mapping archives, and postal databases. The coordinates always pointed to the same expunged area, a region officially designated as undeveloped federal land. Yet, when researchers attempted to access or delete the phantom entries, they found that no user permissions existed to alter them. The files appeared to regenerate automatically, each time with slight variations in formatting, as though they were being rewritten by an unseen system that insisted on the town's existence. Even stranger, the population field wasn't blank. Each data reappearance listed fluctuating numbers, sometimes 5, sometimes 22, occasionally 71, as if someone, or something, was still living there. The entries were time-stamped with recent dates and authenticated with real government encryption keys, suggesting that whatever process was producing them was operating from within a secure federal network. IT specialists brought in to trace the anomaly reported that the metadata originated from a closed communication node buried deep in the region's historical archives, one tied to obsolete military infrastructure from the Second World War. Every attempt to sever the connection failed. The system would simply re-establish itself elsewhere, replicating the town's name and coordinates in new servers. The re-emergence sparked renewed public fascination. Conspiracy theorists claimed it was evidence of an ongoing project hidden under layers of administrative obfuscation, while historians suggested it was the digital echo of an erased settlement reasserting itself through the very records meant to destroy it. Journalists who investigated were met with unusual resistance. One reporter described receiving a phone call from an unlisted number after filing a Freedom of Information request. The voice on the other end whispered only a date, April 1942, then the line went dead. Days later, her office was burglarized, and all files related to the erased town were stolen. Satellite imagery from the early 1990s added another layer to the mystery. Analysts reviewing thermal data discovered irregular heat signatures in the same grid pattern as the old town streets. The anomalies pulsed rhythmically, with cycles repeating every 7 seconds, the same harmonic ratio embedded in the original blueprints. Attempts to image the site with higher-resolution equipment always resulted in data corruption or blank returns. It was as if the land itself refused to be observed, reasserting its boundaries not through maps or memory, but through the coded architecture of the systems designed to forget it. The erased town had not only haunted history, it had infiltrated the machinery of record itself, rewriting its absence into a new, digital form of presence. Focuses on the testimonies of former government employees and contractors who, years later, began leaking fragments of information suggesting that the erased town had never been completely abandoned, it had been transformed into a controlled experiment in isolation and perception. Between 1995 and 2008, several anonymous statements surfaced on message boards, local radio call-ins, and eventually in declassified documents obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. These individuals, all claiming to have worked for military engineering or defense communications divisions, described a classified project referred to as Operation Echo Glass. The operation's goal, according to them, was to study the long-term effects of electromagnetic resonance on human cognition, using architectural geometry as the delivery mechanism. They alleged that the erased town had served as both the testing ground and containment site for this research, a living apparatus disguised as a community, where infrastructure itself was the experiment. One former technician described being flown into a fenced compound under the guise of maintaining outdated radio towers. Once inside, he realized the towers weren't transmitting but receiving, picking up low-frequency signals emanating from beneath the ground. The signal pattern, he said, pulsed in harmonic intervals identical to those encoded in the town's lost blueprints. He claimed the readings matched the rhythm of brainwave frequencies associated with dreaming. Another whistleblower described working in a subterranean facility beneath the old site, where corridors were built in curved patterns designed to deflect magnetic interference. He noted that sound behaved unnaturally inside those tunnels, footsteps echoed before being made, and spoken words sometimes repeated minutes after utterance, as though time itself had developed feedback. The most startling confession came from a systems analyst who claimed to have monitored population metrics in the area during the early 2000s. He insisted that biological readings, body temperatures, heart rates, and movement traces continued to appear in the restricted zone, even though satellite scans showed no human activity. These readings, he said, were consistent with people moving through streets that no longer existed. When he flagged the data as a technical fault, his clearance was revoked, and the logs were erased from the database. All these testimonies shared one cryptic detail: the alleged experiment had never officially ended. According to one document, the site remains active for passive observation, implying that something within the buried town still generated measurable phenomena. Even decades after its supposed erasure, equipment reportedly stationed miles away continued to pick up electromagnetic fluctuations that synchronized perfectly with the original 7.3 Hz resonance frequency. If true, it would mean the experiment's machinery, or whatever it had become, was still operating autonomously, independent of oversight. The erased town was no longer merely a forgotten settlement, it had evolved into a self-sustaining mechanism, pulsing beneath the surface of American soil, hidden in plain sight under the guise of bureaucratic oblivion. Explores the psychological and cultural aftermath of the erased town's mystery, how it began to shape the collective identity of the surrounding region, embedding itself into folklore, art, and even the subconscious of those who lived nearby. By the late 2000s, the town that no longer existed had become a haunting presence in the American psyche, a symbol of both erasure and control. Local communities began referring to the phenomenon as the silence beneath, a name born from the eerie stillness that seemed to blanket the area at night, where even insects and birds refused to make a sound. People spoke of feeling watched when passing the fenced perimeter, describing the sensation not as fear, but recognition, as if the land itself remembered them. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers started incorporating references to the town into their work, grainy visuals of nameless streets, looping tones of 7.3 Hz embedded in ambient soundtracks, and recurring imagery of houses without addresses. Psychologists studying the region noticed an unusual concentration of shared dreams among residents. People reported visions of walking through empty neighborhoods that glowed faintly under an unseen light, where every house had open doors but no interiors. The dreams often ended with the dreamer standing before a signpost that bore no name, only a blank metal plate that reflected their face distorted and multiplied. When researchers catalogued these accounts, they found startling consistency in the details, despite participants having no connection to each other. Some began to theorize that the erased town had become a kind of cognitive imprint, a mental echo that persisted within the collective unconscious of nearby populations. Meanwhile, the local school curriculum began omitting references to the town altogether, replacing it with vague lessons about urban planning failures and infrastructure reassignment. Children who grew up near the area described being warned never to approach the fence line, yet none could explain why. Over time, the absence itself became its own form of presence, a silence that demanded interpretation. By the 2010s, a small subculture of Internet investigators and paranormal archivists had formed around the enigma, analyzing every leaked photo, every corrupted file, every map fragment. Their online forums became repositories of speculative theology and data-driven obsession. They claimed that the town's design had embedded itself into the fabric of digital networks, subtly influencing algorithms, pattern recognition systems, and even human thought processes that engaged with it. As the phenomenon spread through online culture, its mythology evolved from local folklore into a modern parable about memory, surveillance, and entropy. People began to see the town not just as a place, but as a process, a system that erased itself to ensure its own survival. It had become a mirror of civilization's own hidden machinery, the urge to forget, to rewrite, and to bury what once existed, until the act of forgetting itself becomes the only thing that remains alive. As years passed and the world moved on from the turmoil of the 1940s, the ghost of the vanished town refused to fade from memory. Historians and local researchers began to treat it as one of America's strangest disappearances, a town erased from both geography and consciousness. The coordinates that once defined its location now pointed to nothing but a dense, overgrown forest, as if nature itself had swallowed the evidence. Yet whispers persisted. Travelers spoke of roads that appeared on no map, paths that seemed to lead in circles, and the faint sound of church bells drifting through the mist long after midnight. The deeper one looked, the more it became clear that the disappearance wasn't a simple case of abandonment. There were fragments of old government correspondence hinting at restricted zones, sealed investigations, and military interests that coincided with the town's final days. Some believed that the town had been evacuated for a wartime project and later buried under classified operations. Others were certain something far older had claimed it, something that predated the maps, the buildings, and even the settlers themselves. When aerial surveys were conducted decades later, they revealed faint rectangular impressions in the soil like the ghostly remains of streets, foundations, and fences. Strangely, there were no visible street patterns, no clear urban plan, just scattered grids that led nowhere. It was as if the town had been deliberately designed to be forgotten, constructed in a way that defied cartography. The absence of street names began to take on symbolic weight. Some speculated that it was intentional, an experiment in anonymity, a community without identifiers, where location, identity, and memory could dissolve into the landscape. Others viewed it as a curse, that naming the streets would have anchored the town to reality, preventing it from being erased. The strangest accounts came from a handful of old residents, or at least people who claimed to have been children there before the disappearance. Their memories were fragmented, dreamlike. They spoke of mornings that never seemed to begin, of shadows that stretched too long across the dirt roads, and of signs that were blank even before the town vanished. They remembered a place that seemed to exist slightly out of sync with time, where visitors sometimes arrived but never seemed to leave. Whether these memories were real or merely the product of folklore is impossible to prove, but together they formed a chilling mosaic, a portrait of a town that was never truly meant to exist, and whose disappearance might not have been an accident at all. In 1963, an unmarked box surfaced in a county records office several miles from the region where the nameless town had once existed. Inside were brittle documents, faded maps, and a series of black and white photographs depicting rows of identical houses and wide dirt paths with no visible signs or names. Each photo was stamped with the same date, June 14, 1942, the last recorded year before the town disappeared. What startled investigators most was that none of these photographs matched any known settlement within the state. It was as though the town existed outside every known jurisdiction. The maps were equally strange, streets drawn as faint lines that ended abruptly, clusters of buildings arranged without logic, and a river that appeared to bend differently than it did in any topographic survey. One page, handwritten in ink that had nearly vanished, bore only the words Area 5 under observation, no identifiers permitted. That single line became the center of decades of speculation, implying that the nameless town had been part of some larger classified project, perhaps tied to wartime secrecy or psychological experimentation. Researchers soon discovered that several residents listed in census archives vanished from public record after 1942. No death certificates, no migration trails, just erased identities. Their family members, when traced, either claimed ignorance or refused to speak at all. One descendant, when questioned in the 1970s, reportedly said they were told never to name the place. It wasn't supposed to be remembered. This cryptic statement only deepened the mystery. The photographs were analyzed for landmarks or coordinates, but every attempt to identify the terrain ended in contradiction. Hills seemed to shift between images, tree lines that appeared dense in one photograph were barren in another. It was as if the environment itself had changed or been altered between exposures. A few skeptics proposed that the box was a hoax planted by local historians to reignite interest in the mystery. But the material evidence argued otherwise. The film stock, ink composition, and paper were all verified as genuine artifacts from the 1940s. Still, no one could determine who had taken the photos or why they had been hidden for more than 20 years. The final photograph in the box, though, was the most haunting. It showed what looked like the center of town, a large, open square surrounded by identical houses. At its heart stood a signpost with 4 arms pointing in different directions. Each wooden plank was completely blank, without a single carved letter or painted word. It was a symbol of erasure, a chilling reminder that the town without names had not been forgotten by accident, but by deliberate design. By 1980, an urban renewal project unexpectedly uncovered fragments of the lost town beneath a newly planned industrial site near the outskirts of what was once believed to be farmland. Construction workers unearthed stone foundations, rusted lampposts, and remnants of what appeared to be old street dividers, yet none bore any lettering or numbering. Every metal plate, every possible signpost had been scraped clean or removed entirely, leaving behind only the physical skeleton of a vanished community. Archaeologists were called in, but the absence of inscriptions made it nearly impossible to identify who had lived there or why the entire settlement had been buried under layers of soil and silence. What struck investigators most was the meticulousness of the erasure. It wasn't decay, nor was it the careless passage of time. Someone had intentionally stripped this town of its identity, down to the last marker. Among the rubble, teams found fragments of porcelain dishes, small toys, and remnants of wartime ration tins, suggesting the inhabitants lived during the early 1940s, consistent with the year when all traces of the town disappeared. But deeper excavations revealed something even stranger. The foundations were laid out in a pattern that didn't align with conventional urban design. Streets curved into loops that led nowhere, intersections ended in dead ends, and several homes were built facing inward, as if their windows avoided the outer world. One archaeologist described it as a town built to conceal itself. Even more unsettling were the underground chambers found beneath certain structures, small, reinforced rooms with heavy latches on the inside. No one could determine their purpose, though theories ranged from air raid shelters to containment rooms for classified experiments. Government interest quickly followed the discovery. Within weeks, the excavation site was sealed, and federal officials took control of the artifacts, citing security interests. The workers were reportedly told to sign non-disclosure agreements, and public discussion of the find vanished as quickly as the town had decades earlier. Local newspapers that initially covered the discovery retracted their stories without explanation. Residents nearby recalled seeing military trucks remove large containers under the cover of night. The official explanation stated that the materials were radioactive remnants of a decommissioned wartime facility, but no radiation traces were ever reported. Whispers soon circulated that the erased town was part of an abandoned social experiment, one meant to test isolation, obedience, or psychological resilience under controlled conditions. Others believed it had been the site of a military prototype city used for secret training operations. Yet, the precision of the erasure suggested something deeper, a collective decision to erase not just a place, but memory itself. The town's absence had become more powerful than its existence, echoing through history as a silent monument to whatever truth had been buried with it. By the early 2000s, whispers of the vanished town had evolved into a kind of forbidden folklore, an echo passed between aging locals, historians, and a few determined researchers who refused to let the mystery fade. A retired surveyor named Harold Kitterman, who had once worked on state mapping contracts, stumbled upon something extraordinary in a box of forgotten county blueprints, an unmarked grid, hand-drawn in graphite, matching the coordinates of the erased site. It was labeled only District 12B, Restricted Access, 1942. No public records listed such a district, and the designation didn't align with any known wartime zoning. When Kitterman tried to obtain federal land records, he was told the files were sealed indefinitely for national security. That only deepened his resolve to uncover what was being hidden, and soon he began documenting his findings in a private journal. In one of his last entries, Kitterman described visiting the area in 2003. The ground was uneven, overgrown with brittle weeds and clusters of dead trees that formed unnatural geometric lines. He reported a faint hum beneath the soil, as if machinery far below was still running. His compass malfunctioned repeatedly, spinning wildly even when he stood still. Locals had long avoided the site, claiming their radios went static near its borders and their vehicles often stalled for no mechanical reason. What unnerved Kitterman most was a row of concrete slabs hidden under moss and dirt, aligned perfectly north to south. When he brushed one off, he found a small engraved number, 12B. The same code as his mysterious map. After Kitterman's notes surfaced online years later, amateur historians and conspiracy enthusiasts flooded forums with theories. Some suggested the town had been used to test experimental communication technologies during World War II, signals that could distort magnetic fields or disrupt perception itself. Others linked it to early government research on psychological conditioning, arguing that the entire population might have been unknowingly part of a classified behavioral experiment. But there were darker hypotheses too, that the town was never meant to exist publicly at all, and when the experiment concluded or failed it was buried, its residents relocated or silenced. When investigators attempted to verify Kitterman's findings, they found his journal missing from archives and his family reluctant to speak. He had died suddenly in 2006, reportedly of natural causes, though no coroner's report was ever filed publicly. In the years since, occasional satellite anomalies have appeared in that region, flickers of geometric shadows and heat signatures with no structures to account for them. Yet, official maps continue to show nothing but empty land. To this day, the coordinates of District 12B remain untouched, unclaimed, and classified, as if the Earth itself is guarding whatever secret still hums beneath it. In 2021, a drone hobbyist named Olivia Crane reignited the mystery when her aerial footage over a forested patch of undeveloped land captured what appeared to be the faint outline of a perfectly symmetrical town grid hidden beneath layers of overgrowth. From above, the ground patterns formed the unmistakable structure of intersecting streets, a central square, and rectangular plots where buildings once stood, but when she visited the site on foot, none of it existed. What her drone had captured was a ghost layout visible only from altitude, as though the Earth still remembered what human hands had built and buried. Intrigued, Olivia returned multiple times, each flight producing more anomalies. In one video, faint glimmers of light seemed to pulse in straight lines across the soil, moving as though following invisible streets. Her footage quickly spread online, drawing the attention of urban historians, digital forensics experts, and government agencies alike. Within weeks, her account was deleted, her videos removed for national security reasons, and she vanished from public view. Those who managed to download her videos before deletion noticed subtle inconsistencies in the timestamps. Each clip appeared to skip forward exactly 42 seconds at random intervals, and faint auditory distortions could be heard beneath the drone's hum, almost resembling a coded signal. Sound engineers who studied it reported an underlying frequency too deliberate to be mechanical interference. When converted to a visual spectrogram, the signal formed the outline of letters, NONAME. Whether coincidence or encryption, no one could agree. What was clear, however, was that something beneath the soil was still emitting power, data, or both. Independent researchers proposed that remnants of underground infrastructure, possibly communication cables or buried equipment, were still active, pulsing intermittently as they had during wartime. Satellite imagery reviewed later that year revealed that the coordinates of Olivia's drone flights had been replaced with a blurred gray overlay, standard protocol only for classified or restricted zones. No official record acknowledged that the area had ever been restricted before, yet its sudden censorship suggested otherwise. A small group of digital archivists, determined to preserve what remained of Olivia's discovery, re-uploaded portions of her footage to encrypted servers. But even there, files began to degrade, losing data as if intentionally corrupted from an external source. The erasure felt familiar, echoing the same precision that wiped the town from maps 8 decades earlier. Local residents near the site reported low-frequency vibrations at night and the occasional flicker of light between the trees, like distant lamps turning on in a place that officially didn't exist. Some began to believe the town itself was re-emerging, not physically, but as an echo, a residual imprint of human presence seeping through the layers of time. Others whispered that Olivia's disappearance wasn't an accident, but a continuation of the same pattern that had erased the town in 1942, preserving its silence by removing anyone who tried to make it heard again. As the echoes of this unsolved mystery dissolve into the depths of forgotten time, remember, history never truly sleeps, it waits, watching, buried beneath the dust and the silence. Subscribe to *Secrets of History*, and step with us beyond the veil, where every artifact hides a heartbeat and every whisper carries a truth long denied. Activate the bell, and when the past calls again, you'll be the first to hear its voice.